So, for our last lecture on the politics of the Gilded Age, we pick up with the election of 1892. So, when we last left the politics of this era, the Populist Party had been founded and came up with their Omaha platform in 1892, and they do field a candidate for president in the election, the former Greenback Labor Party leader James Weaver of Iowa. You have President Benjamin Harrison up for re-election, facing his former foe, the former president, Democrat Grover Cleveland. And the way this election plays out is the populists show some strength in the North. Weaver gets more than 1 million votes in the country, wins 22 electoral votes, almost all in the North, loses very badly in the South, has no chance to be competitive because of how poorly he does in the South. But with the help of the populist ticket and the unpopular McKinley tariff, remember the highest tariffs we'd had in American history, I think it was about 46% tax rate on imports. So between the million votes that go to Weaver, between the unpopularity of some of Harrison's economic policies, Grover Cleveland wins both the popular vote and the electoral vote and becomes the only president to serve 2 terms, not consecutively. So he serves for 4 years, he loses, comes back 4 years later, wins again. Only president in the history to do that. But he is saddled with another catastrophe. And this catastrophe shows itself in the form of the Panic of 1893. Almost immediately after Cleveland takes the oath of office, America enters into one of its worst and longest depressions in our history. And like any other depression, the causes are there. We've talked about depressions and recessions before. We've talked about what we call panics before. And the themes are almost always the same. Over speculation leads to a market crash. Once a market crashes, people start to lose money. Banks lose money. People lose confidence. It's a very vicious cycle. On top of that, railroads had been overbuilt. And with too many railroads unable to get enough passengers to make a profit, many railroads become bankrupt. And this depression pretty much lasts for the entirety of Cleveland's second term, pretty much all 4 years. Other things that happened during the panic, farm foreclosures reach an all-time high. Unemployment hits about 20%, which is very high for any economic downturn. 20% is tough, especially if it's for an extended period of time. If it's for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, that's not so much of a problem. But if it's for a year, then 20% is horrible. People had to rely on soup kitchens to get meals, to put food in their stomachs. And also you see the rise of what we call hobos. Hobos were homeless people who rode train cars across the country looking for work, looking, to kind of live the life of a free person, I guess. But the reality is they lived very destitute lives, and the only positive that came from this lifestyle was being able to see the entire country. Cleveland was more hands-off this term and championed the gold standard as well, and so his presidency is kind of marred by economic problems and unpopularity with the majority of Americans. Like I was saying, Grover Cleveland was a fan of the gold standard, and so Depression politics, his favorability towards the gold standard, you start to see some changes in American monetary policy. A decline in silver prices led investors to trade off their silver dollars in exchange for gold dollars. And again, remember the rate was about 16-1 that the government was producing, and that was at the high. And so as the value went down, you were not getting great rates of return. The gold reserve, because of the influx of gold dollars to the market, got dangerously low. And when you use gold to back up your currency, you can't let your reserves fall low, because then your currency has no value. Cleveland tried to repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890, but that does not stop the gold drain. And so what he ends up doing to solve this problem is one of our old friends from the very beginning of this unit comes back into play. John Pierpont Morgan comes back into play, J.P. Morgan, and he loans the government $65 million in gold to support the gold standard. It does stop the gold drain, and it does kind of rebuild the reserves, and it makes Morgan a ton of money. But the reality is it does very little to change the American perception that the government was only there, only concerned, only there to help Eastern bankers like Morgan. And this just solidifies that belief. Now, the reality is this is a good move for Morgan. It's guaranteed return on money. And it's a good move for Cleveland if you want to stick with the gold standard. So it's kind of a win-win. It has nothing to do with Morgan being an Eastern banker. It has everything to do with the fact that he is one of the few Americans that had $65 million in gold that he could lend the government. Okay. In 1894, we have the Wilson-Gorman tariff, which moderately reduced the tariff rate, but it also tried to do something that had not been done in a very long time in America, and that was an income tax. Part of the Wilson-Gorman tariff was that it had a 2% tax on all income above $2,000 a year, which to you probably does not sound like very much money. However, the average American income in 1894 was less than $1,000 per year. And so if you made over $2,000 in a year, you were well above the average income rate. And so this would have produced a massive amount of money. It would have more than made up for the loss in revenue from the reduced tariff. But within a year of its passage, the Supreme Court comes in and says that an income tax is unconstitutional, which is exactly why, in order to have an income tax in the modern day, we had to amend the Constitution to do that. Also, during this time, like I said, the jobless rate was at about 20% at the peak of the panic. And so in 1894, a man from Ohio by the name of Jacob Coxey led the jobless in a march on Washington. This motley crew, as they were, was referred to as Coxey's Army. And their demand was pretty simple. Spend, as a federal government, $500 million on public works projects, because those projects would create jobs and the unemployment rate would go down. It was actually kind of a very rational policy idea. Unfortunately, Coxey was arrested, and when he was arrested and the leader was gone, the other marchers just kind of returned home and got very little for their effort. And this is kind of like other things we've talked about in the past. When there's a labor dispute and a labor leader is arrested, thrown in jail, we talked about it with Eugene V. Debs earlier, it just kind of falls apart. And that's kind of tough. Like I was saying, it was really tough for Cleveland and for the workers and for everybody. And so as we approach 1896 and as the panic has been going for 4 years, the better part of 4 years, the Democratic Party is split. You have on one hand the pro-gold members of the party supporting Grover Cleveland. On the other hand, you have the pro-silver members who wanted someone else, someone who did not support the gold standard, someone who supported the average person. And it really kind of comes to a head at the Democratic Convention in 1896. A guy by the name of William Jennings Bryan. He's from Nebraska, and he is speaking to the delegates. He's giving a speech, and his speech is going on, and I'm going to post a video of about William Jennings Bryan in the classroom, and you'll hear a part of the speech. And so I'm not going to do my interpretation, my impression of his speech. I will tell you that his speech ends with these words: "We will answer their demands for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." The speech becomes known as the Cross of Gold speech. Now, William Jennings Bryan was only 36 years old, which makes me feel old since, I am now pushing 40, and this guy was 36, gives a speech at the Democratic National Convention, and immediately becomes the Democratic Party's nominee for president. The Goldbug Democrats who supported Cleveland basically just gave up on the party. The populists choose Bryan also as their candidate, so there's not a populist party candidate in this election to split the vote. The Goldbugs either support a third party, minor party that is kind of irrelevant, or they voted Republican in this election. Again, they switched parties because the party stopped believing what they believed in. They didn't just vote for the Democrat because they were Democrats. The person running didn't agree with them, and so they voted for somebody else. It's a very novel idea in modern American politics, where we tend to just vote for whatever the party is and not for what the actual person is. The Republicans, on the other hand, nominate William McKinley of Ohio. McKinley is pro-tariff. Remember, we had the McKinley tariff earlier. Same guy. He was also, though, known as a friend of labor. So on one hand, he is pro-business. He wants to raise the tariff to help American businesses. But on the other hand, he's also known as a friend of the working man. And the reality is that he runs one of the first modern campaigns financed by a wealthy millionaire by the name of Marcus Hanna. And Hanna runs the campaign from kind of behind the scenes. I guess you could say he was the first real campaign manager. And the Republicans basically blamed the Democrats for the Panic of 1893. The reality is the Republicans were responsible for the Panic of 1893. Cleveland became president, inherited what Benjamin Harrison had done, and was stuck with those politics and those policies. It wasn't like the panic happened at the end of the presidency. It was at the very beginning. You can't blame someone who gets hit with the panic the moment they take over. However, the Republicans used Hanna's money to spread that information out there. The platform for the Republican Party proposed a high tariff, again, like I was saying, to protect businesses, but it did also uphold the gold standard against the silver standard. And again, it shows you why maybe some Goldbug Democrats voted for McKinley, because he was not in favor of unlimited coinage of silver. He did want to stick to the gold standard, and that was what they believed. And so it makes sense that they would vote based on their wants and needs and not based on the party's wants and needs.